Now it's time for On Point, where we speak to experts to delve deeper into the biggest news stories in the spotlight right now, even while the Russian military slams cities across Ukraine with shells. The two sides recently announced a ceasefire to allow civilians to flee some areas. Whether they've been holding or not is debatable at this point. There were supposed to be lawyers representing Ukraine and Russia going toe-to-toe to go through the legal arguments in regards to this at the UN's top court, the International Court of Justice, in a legal bid to perhaps bring an end to this conflict. Speaking in The Hague on Monday, the permanent representative of the president of Ukraine in Crimea condemned Russia for disrespecting international law. However, the Russians just flat out refused to show up.
Russian forces launched military operations in Ukraine on February 24th, just a matter of days after Moscow recognized Ukraine's breakaway regions, Donetsk and Luhansk, as independent republics. President Putin also said the, quote, special military operation was to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. For more, we're joined by Natasha Kurt, lecturer in international peace and security in the Department of War Studies at King's College London. Good morning.
Good morning, or good evening, yeah. Hi.
Well, firstly, we'd like to know if the International Justice Court has the ability to bring the end to the war, and what powers does the court have to penalize Moscow for its actions in Ukraine?
Okay, the International Court of Justice is part of the UN system, but it doesn't have any kind of enforcement powers. All it can do is to indicate provisional measures, and the state parties can then, should then ideally comply with those measures. But unfortunately, the court doesn't really have any power as such.
Right, it seems highly unlikely that Putin is going to pay any attention to what the International Court of Justice has to say when it comes out with its ruling in the coming days. What kind of legal arguments, though, did Ukraine bring to the table? And I probably know the answer to this, but were you surprised that the Russians didn't bother showing up?
I'm not surprised that the Russians didn't bother showing up, because there wouldn't be too much that they could say. Russia, as you know, is suggesting that Ukraine is committing genocide against Russians within Ukraine. So what Ukraine is doing is something slightly different. People are comparing it to the case of Bosnia and Croatia, when they sued Serbia in the ICJ. So basic in the 1990s. So what Ukraine is trying to say is they're not trying to say Russia is committing genocide in Ukraine. But what they're trying to say is that basically Russia is manipulating the idea of genocide in order to justify aggression. So it's kind of quite a creative way of looking at things.
Well, Natasha, Western powers have been imposing crushing sanctions on Russia, but insist they aren't going to intervene beyond that. Can you see any scenario under which the West would engage directly in military confrontation with Russia? And hypothetically, if that were to happen, what would likely happen?
I think it's very difficult to see the West actually engaging in direct military action with Russia. And I think they've kind of made it very clear that they really completely, want to avoid that, not least because I think it would be very difficult to justify that to their populations, to their respective constituencies, in particular because obviously Russia is a nuclear power. So this is very different to if you compare it to, say, I don't know, Bosnia, in the 1990s, when there was also a lot of debate about whether we should or shouldn't have a no-fly zone and so on. And eventually, we did have a no-fly zone and NATO intervened. But in that case, obviously, Milosevic didn't have nuclear weapons. So I find it very difficult to see that there would be or could be a direct military confrontation with Russia. I mean, obviously, if Russia, for example, launched an attack on the Baltic states, then one might perhaps envisage something like that. But I think really, that's not what people want.
Well, hopefully these economic sanctions will have some effect on Russia. Everyone thinks of Russia as this giant nation, which it is geographically speaking, but its economy is pretty much like that of Italy's, aka just a middle-sized economy. So the sanctions hopefully might have some effect on Putin's decision-making. However, the Russian leader continues to insist, like we talked about, that this war is aimed at demilitarizing and getting rid of these unnamed Nazis within Ukraine. In your eyes, do you think anything Putin is trying to say to justify this conflict holds any water? And if you do, which I expect you do, consider it to be somewhat of a smokescreen, what do you think are the real reasons behind why Putin decided to invade Ukraine?
I mean, the whole idea of denazification, I mean, you have to look back to the Second World War, and this happened in the Baltic states as well, where essentially during the Second World War, you did have those who collaborated with the Nazis because they saw Nazism as a lesser evil than communism. And you had the same scenario actually in former Yugoslavia with Croatians who collaborated with the Nazis. And then that, history was brought back by the Serbs in their fight against the Croats. And that's kind of a similar idea now that, Putin is able to kind of mobilize that narrative because there are still people alive who remember that, and the Second World War has become a kind of, the kind of overarching narrative, really, for Russia, the kind of, myth of the Russian nation, Russia victorious and so on, Russia fighting the Nazis, so, I'm not saying, that this is a kind of true narrative as such, but, there will be Russians within Russia who remember this historical fact. And so, with all of this kind of information warfare, there is usually always a kind of grain of truth, if you like, but obviously it's kind of magnified beyond, in a kind of absurd manner, because the idea, of course, that Zelensky could be a Nazi is absurd, considering that he is Jewish, and so on. So I think that whole narrative also is perhaps breaking down a little bit. It's difficult to tell what Russians within Russia actually think about it because obviously, they're kind of consuming quite often Russian news from Russian TV and so on. But, one of Putin's main advisors, Dmitry Peskov, for example, he seems to have dropped that whole idea of denazification. So it may be that, eventually they're going to realize that narrative perhaps is not really as powerful as they thought it was. So yes, I mean, obviously it's a smokescreen. I'm not sure if that's quite the right word, but what are the real reasons? Well, those reasons are probably to some extent only knowable to Putin, but there are a number of reasons that you could impute to Putin's invasion, which has taken everyone by surprise. Because, I think people thought it would be confined to the eastern part of Ukraine, but there are certainly military objectives that Russia would like to achieve. And for example, the southern port of Kherson, which supplies water to Crimea, that's very important. Also, the town of Mykolaiv, Soviet shipbuilding facility. The Russian Navy needs to build up its capabilities. So there's a lot of infrastructure that I think would be very useful to Russia, apart from the fact that Putin is clearly also quite obsessed, with somehow destroying Ukraine or partially destroying it or disabling it, in the sense that, Russia doesn't like the idea of a kind of democratic kind of liberal democratic country right next door, because it kind of shines a spotlight on, Russia's political system, which is very different.
All right, Natasha, thank you so much for your insights. We assume it's
You're
late over there. Thank you so much for staying up late for us. Hope to talk to you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.